Hi, I'm Tawny Plattis, and you're listening to Dirty Bits, the show that covers the sexy, scandalous, and salacious stories from history your teacher probably left out. Thank you so much to our Dirty Birdies for joining us for our first ever live episode of the Dirty Bits podcast on Patreon. We hope you enjoyed this special look at what goes into making an episode, and look forward to seeing you next week for part 2 of our special, Taking on the Tudors, the mini-series. Please join us live for a 12-hour podcast extravaganza, September 12, from 2 p.m. Eastern Time to 2 a.m. Eastern Time, to raise money for the American Red Cross and support the relief of Hurricane Irma on the Blazing Caribou Studios Facebook page. We'll be joined by our fellow amazing indie podcasters. You'll find special episodes from Cole Sports, Our Americana podcast, the Soapy Madams podcast, See Here's the Thing, Gravity Beard, The Natecast, In Poor Taste, You Can Rewind It, Breakers Podcast, The Jock and Nerd Podcast, The One True Way, Curtis Craddock, Climb Out Network, Film Roast, Pleasing Terrors Podcast, Kiwi Crimes Podcast, Rick and Morty Podcast, and The Brawless Podcast, hosted by Carrie Sims and Donna Hume of Blazing Caribou. Be sure to join us on social media, where we'll be doing giveaways of exciting new merchandise every week. When you sign up for our email list, you'll automatically be entered to win Positively Adorbs merchandise from ATH Fiber Arts, or goodies from our very own Dirty Bits merchandise selection. We love talking with our listeners, and would be delighted if you joined in with us. You might even get a shout out on our next episode. You can find us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/DirtyBitsPodcast, and in our Facebook discussion group, the Dirty Bits Podcast Group, where we post art history memes and talk about all things historically filthy. You can also connect with us on Instagram at Dirty Bits Podcast and Twitter at the Dirty Bits Pod. We'd be positively overjoyed if you let us know how we're doing by leaving us a review on Facebook, iTunes, or just shooting an email over to Tawny@TawnyVoice.com. All of our links are available in the show notes here and on our fabulous network's website, orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can find all of our pod brothers and pod sister. Many of you have requested longer, bigger, more frequent episodes. We would absolutely love to bring the show to you full time. If that's something you would like to see, you can help us work towards making that a reality by visiting us at patreon.com/dirtybits and becoming an official Dirty Birdie. Every donation is a step towards achieving our goal of bringing more to the show, like animation, merchandise, live shows, tours, and much more. A giant thank you to our newest Dirty Birdies, Trenton Bennett and Dylan McNamara, who have donated on Patreon. We are seriously overwhelmed by your generosity and are so excited to start sending you all of the patron-only goodies for your enjoyment. Every one of your contributions to the show means so much, especially to those who aren't able to donate. George and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Enjoy the show. The Tudors. Most people, including myself, typically associate the family house with Henry VIII of England, his daughter Elizabeth I, and her sister, the infamous Bloody Mary. But when I began weeding through the branches of the European monarchy, when George and I decided to take on the Tudors, I found that the family and all of their shenanigans stretch back to at least the French House of Valois and the German Bavarian House of Wittelsbach in the 14th century. Our story begins with Isabeau of Bavaria and Charles VI, King of France. Charles was only 11 when he inherited the crown, right smack dab in the middle of the 100 Years' War. His 4 uncles, a gaggle of dukes, were the head honchos in charge until Charles was 21, even though adulthood was considered reached by the age of 14. While I'd usually make some joke about 14 being the epitome of maturity, his uncles actually did pretty well fucking shit up themselves. They blew all the kingdom's financial resources on what was described as frivolities, so you can assume they're referring to Rolexes, cars, and cocaine. When they started looking low on funds, the Duke said, "No biggie, just jack up the taxes." To which the people responded with a resounding, "This is horse shit, let's stage some revolts." When the king gets to be about 20, 21, he goes, "Y'all need to get the fuck out, Mr. Dukes," and he dismisses his uncles. He brings back his father's former advisors, and the political and economic conditions improve immensely, which earns him the title of Charles the Beloved. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, was the daughter of Duke Stephen III of Bavaria and Taddea Visconti of Milan. When she was around 15, she was sent to France at the suggestion of her uncle to be a potential bride to the king. Her dad was reluctant, and her uncle goes, "Look, this would be a great match to build an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire against those English bastards. Let's take her on a pilgrimage so she won't know we're trying to marry her off. And we don't even have to do the usual nude examination that is totally customary right now." So her dad goes, "God, I'm going to regret this. Okay, fine, go ahead." About a month before she's about to be considered as a prospective match to the King of France, she stays with her uncle and his wife in the country, where they swap out her Bavarian clothes for French ones, and she's instructed in court etiquette. She was a quick learner, and they were like, "This girl is sharp." So they take her to the king, where she's inspected, standing motionless, which was considered perfect behavior at the time. Historian Tracy Adams wrote in her biography that Charles was said to have felt, "Happiness and love enter his heart, for he saw that she was beautiful and young, and thus he greatly desired to gaze at her and possess her." And they got married 3 days later. Jean-François, the court historian, described the wedding as having lascivious guests and called them, and I quote, "a hot young couple." They had this total fairy tale princess marriage. Charles heaped on the gifts, giving her a red velvet palfrey saddle trimmed with copper, and rings, tableware, and clothing. In 1389, she's coronated in this Vanderbilt-esque-like party in Paris for 5 days with this off-the-wall squad that includes her cousin Valentina, who made her entrance with 1,300 knights carrying personal luxuries such as books and a harp. And there's all these noble women in the procession, too, who wore costumes that could rival Lady Gaga, while they rode in on these extravagant litters and were also escorted by knights. Another dude rocked this piece of clothing embroidered with 40 sheep and 40 swans, where each one is decorated with a bell made of pearls. The streets are lined with these actors and tableaus portraying the Crusades and the gates of paradise. There are these kids dressed as angels singing, and there's an acrobat holding 2 candles walking along a rope suspended from the cathedral to the tallest house in the city. As Isabeau crosses the bridge to Notre Dame, they have this person dressed as an angel rigged up on some kind of harness who descends from the bridge like they're freaking Liberace, and then places a crown on Isabeau's head. After the coronation, they travel back along this route that's lit by 500 candles until they reach the royal feast, and are presented with a narrative pageant that depicts the fall of Troy. To pay for it all, they just raised taxes a couple months later, which went over great with the common folk. In just a couple of years, in 1392, Isabeau's husband, King Charles, suffers from what they called his first bout of insanity. He may have had schizophrenia and would struggle with psychosis for the rest of his life. The story goes that when King Charles VI found out his friend and advisor, Olivier de Clisson, was the victim of an attempted assassination, he said something to the effect of, "Who was it? It was Pierre de Crayon? He's hiding in Brittany? Oh, I know that asshat, and I am not going to stand for this dog shit." So he calls up the Duke of Brittany and goes, "Hey, there's a would-be murderer staying in the vicinity you preside over. I'm gonna need you to send that fool my way." And the Duke of Brittany goes, "That's not gonna work for me." Which kind of astounded me that he could say that to the king, but Charles goes, "Fine, military expedition it is." And the king was pumped. His friends were looking at each other like, he is weirdly stoked to do this, isn't he? And did you notice the weird, disjointed sentences? Do you think he's okay? I'm sure he's fine. It's fine. And the army is just creeping along, and Charles is impatient because, the king is used to instant gratification. And he didn't even have internet. So they're traveling through the forest, and one of the guys he's with drops a lance against a steel helmet another guy is carrying. And this was like the gong that awoke something in Charles. He shuddered, takes out his sword, and belts out, "Forward against the traitors! They wish to deliver me to the enemy!" He spurs his horse and starts swinging at his own men. He killed 4 guys before a group of soldiers were able to wrangle him off his horse and onto the ground, where he then fell into a coma. They bring him home, and this 92-year-old physician who is the best in the biz is called over to treat him. King Charles wakes up, fever's totally gone. The doctor goes, "I'm going to go ahead and give you a prescription to partay." And he suggests that the king indulge in some amusements, probably today's equivalent of take a chill pill. So the king and 4 of his friends go to a masked ball his wife is putting on for one of her ladies to celebrate her recent marriage. They were said to be dressed in costumes of linen cloth sewn onto their bodies and soaked in resinous wax or pitch to hold a covering of frazzled hemp so that they appeared shaggy and hairy from head to foot. One of the king's buddies sees this and goes, "That's highly flammable. Maybe keep the torchbearers to the side over there, away from the drunken dancing?" And Charles goes, "Oh, great idea." But the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, gets there late, so he didn't get the memo. He gets too close to one of the masqueraders with a torch and sets the guy on fire. People freaked out as the flames spread. 4 people died, and King Charles barely survived the night. And people were like, what the hell happened? He's just crazy, batshit out of nowhere. Clearly this is sorcery from that ugly wife of his with the heavy German accent. People were super mean to Isabeau throughout her life, spreading so many rumors that historians can't even agree on what she looked like because the description changed dramatically depending on who was talking about her. She's been described both as small and brunette, tall and blonde, beautiful and hypnotic, and so obese through dropsy that she was crippled. From that point on, Charles would have episodes for the rest of his life. In another episode during 1395 and 1396, he believed he was St. George and would run wildly through the halls of his palace until it got to the point of needing the entrances walled up. And then he thought he was made out of glass, so he would take various precautions to ensure he wouldn't break. Like he had iron rods sewed into his clothing so he wouldn't shatter if he came in contact with anything or anyone. Then in 1405, he didn't bathe or change his clothes for 5 months. During one episode in 1393, he couldn't remember that he was king or his own name. When Isabeau came to visit, he didn't recognize her and asked his servants to give her whatever she wanted so she would go away. The monk of St. Denis wrote in his chronicles, "What distressed her above all was to see how on all occasions the king repulsed her, whispering to his people, 'Who is this woman obstructing my view? Find out what she wants and stop her from annoying and bothering me.'" This was incredibly painful for Isabeau, and when she moved into a different residency during his time of illness, she was accused of abandoning him by the people. Because the king didn't recognize his wife during his episodes and seemed to be distressed by her presence, it was decided that Charles needed a mistress. It's not totally clear how it precisely came about, but I did find that Isabeau had most likely suggested providing the king with another gal to get down with in the bedroom. Her name was Odette de Champdivers, a 17-year-old who had a similar appearance to the king's wife, and was called the Little Queen. She was the daughter of a horse dealer and was described as being patient, kind, beautiful, and caring. She had at least one daughter with the king, and also may have introduced playing cards to French society when she used them for the king's amusement. Now, this is where things get a little murky, as is common when studying the dirty bits of centuries gone by. We know for certain the king would endure these months-long battles with psychosis, so naturally somebody had to make decisions while he was out of office. Consequently, there's this gnarly power struggle going on between the king's brother and the 4 dukes who had previously run the country as regents for Charles when he was in his youth. Isabeau was recognized for her negotiating skills during this time, and earned a reputation for an effective mediator in matters of state, even preventing civil war at one point. When Charles was in a state of recovery, he appointed her principal guardian of their son, who would become king, which gave her more power on the Regency Council. That meant that she had an unusual amount of control and power over not only the education and protection of the heir to the throne, but she also had power over the dukes. This made her vulnerable to attack because everyone was vying for the throne. Isabeau then became tight with her husband's brother, the Duke of Orleans, and when they decided to raise taxes, people started spreading rumors that they were sleeping together, which was considered incest at the time. And as I mentioned before, people really rolled with the rumors and repeated really nasty shit about her. This one Augustinian friar, Jacques Legrand, gives this long-ass sermon to the court saying, "You women with your exposed neck, your naked shoulders, and all this décolletage are sinful. Yeah, I'm talking about you over there, Miss Queen. You are wearing some salacious, scandalous clothes, you two-bit hussy." He was actually documented as presenting the sermon as allegory, and was just heavily insinuating that he was talking about Isabeau and her ladies when he described certain women as furious, vengeful characters. He then straight up told Isabeau to her face, "If you don't believe me, go out into the city disguised as a poor woman, and you will hear what everyone is saying." And then he accused her of being out of touch, because he was not very nice. Then this satirical political pamphlet comes out that hinted at the affair between the queen and her brother-in-law as well. Today it's considered propaganda by most historians. Tensions continued to mount until 1407, when John the Fearless, the king's cousin and regent, ordered the assassination of the Duke of Orleans. In what would make a great true crime episode, he hired some guys to take him out, which they did by attacking the Duke when he was riding his horse home. They cut off his hand that was holding the reins, and then hacked him to death with swords, axes, and wooden clubs. They then left his body in the gutter. At first, John the Fearless was like, "Oh no, what happened to the Duke of Orleans? I certainly didn't do anything." And everyone was like, "Don't give us that crap, of course you did." And John goes, "Okay, yeah, I did, but I did it in the name of the Queen's honor. I will avenge the monarchy," referring to the alleged adultery between the Queen and Orleans. And John's uncles are like, "Are you fucking serious, bro? You need to leave, like, now. Get out of Paris today." Theologian and professor Jean Petit then presents this big defense of John the Fearless to the court, saying that while the king was indisposed, Orleans had become a greedy necromancer, sorcerer, tyrant who had tried to kill his brother at the masked ball his wife had thrown. He said that John should be exonerated because he had acted in the interest of the monarchy by killing Orleans. Charles was unfortunately not in a good place during the presentation and went, "Dude, you're so right." And John the Fearless was pardoned. But then the king changed his mind again just a few months later. The following years were filled with turmoil as the instability of the kingdom grew. Isabeau, whose primary concern was the physical safety and control of her children, had to change her alliances frequently to protect her family. This resulted in people criticizing her and labeling her as unstable. Her two eldest sons died, and the youngest one was disinherited for hacking John the Fearless to death. Since the French throne was without an heir, the King of England, Henry V of the Lancaster house, swoops in and starts invading the shit out of France. By 1419, the King of England, Henry Lancaster, occupied pretty much all of Normandy and was like, "Why don't you come sign this Treaty of Troyes? Charles can still be king, but I get to govern France and control everything I've been conquering, and I'll become Charles' successor, okay?" And Isabeau goes to sign the treaty and has to stand in for her husband because this is happening during one of his bouts of mental illness. That resulted in people associating her with the signing of France away to Britain. King Charles of France passed away in 1422, allegedly with his petite queen, Odette, by his side, and not his wife. Odette's name was supposedly the last thing he said before he died. After he passed, Odette and her teenage daughter stopped receiving pensions from the monarchy and were reduced to and died in poverty. Today there's a breed of French rose that's named for her that's a pretty pink with little white spots. As Henry V had died earlier that year, his infant son, Henry VI, whose mother was Isabeau's daughter, the Queen of England, Catherine Valois, became King of France. Rumors started running rampant once more about Isabeau's promiscuity. They were saying that her surviving disinherited son wasn't actually her husband's, and she was often compared to her contemporary, Joan of Arc, who was considered virginal and pure. There was this saying that went, even as France had been lost by a woman, it would be saved by a woman. Simultaneously, the word around town was also that Isabeau was in fact Joan of Arc's mother, fathered by the Duke of Orleans, which would have been incredibly impressive because she was born years after he'd been assassinated. Then the monk, Pintoine, wrote that Orleans clung a bit too closely to his sister-in-law, the young and pretty Isabeau of Bavaria, the queen. This ardent brunette was 22. Her husband was insane, and her seductive brother-in-law loved to dance. Beyond that, we can imagine all sorts of things. He went on to accuse her of neglecting her husband, engaging in scandalous, salacious behavior, and he said that she lived on the delights of the flesh. So her entire reputation comes from this one line that this one guy wrote and is totally unsubstantiated. Today, it's no longer considered proof by historians of Isabeau's actions. She eventually went to live with her sister-in-law in the Hotel St. Paul until her death in 1435. Isabeau has largely been considered a floozy, weak, and indecisive throughout much of history. It wasn't until fairly recently that she had been perceived in a new light. She took on an unusual amount of responsibility and power when her husband unexpectedly fell ill, and she was an extremely talented negotiator. She was often painted as one of the greatest villains in history, having failed at looking after her husband and securing the throne with an heir. In her contemporaries' eyes, she dropped the ball on both of those things. She was also accused of leading France into civil war, being an empty-headed German, making poor political choices because she was fat, and she was said to have only become pregnant because it meant she got presents. But upon closer examination, there was little evidence to support the vitriol that was hurled at her for years. Sorcery was a hot topic at the time, with many being accused of practicing magic, and it was believed Isabeau was the cause of her husband's mental state due to her involvement in witchcraft. The reputation stuck well into the 18th and 19th centuries, with Louise de Carliot listing her among the bad queens of France, saying, "Isabeau was raised by the Furies to bring about the ruin of the state and to sell it to its enemies. Isabeau of Bavaria appeared, and her marriage, celebrated in Amiens on July 17, 1385, would be regarded as the most horrifying moment in our history." She was then portrayed as Orleans' passionate lover in the Marquis de Sade's The Secret History of Isabel of Bavaria, the Queen of France. He created this character who was this cold, calculating, greedy, pleasure-seeking bitch, even though de Sade was totally aware that there wasn't any proof behind what he wrote. So to sum up, a Bavarian daughter of a duke married the King of France. They had 12 kids and a nice life until Charles began exhibiting signs of what historians believe was schizophrenia. He forgot who his wife was, so she gave him a mistress, and people accused her of being a witch. Her daughter, Catherine Valois, married Henry V, the King of England. Queen Isabeau of France was accused of sleeping with her brother-in-law. She negotiates peace treaties, and John the Fearless murders the guy she's accused of sleeping with. Her first couple of sons die unexpectedly, and her last one is disinherited for killing John the Fearless. People accuse her of being a nasty woman. England invades, which is awkward because her daughter is queen over there, and then she signs away France to England, which ticks everyone off. The King of England dies, the King of France dies, and Henry VI, the infant son of Catherine Valois, who we're covering next week, becomes the King of France. And this is just the beginning of the scandalous and salacious stories from the House of Tudor. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or corrections for me, feel free to email us at tawny@tawnyvoice.com or let us know on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or on our website, tawnyvoice.com. See you next Tuesday.